Hey guys, we are finally wrapping up our coverage of Australian Survivor Titans vs Rebels with a review where I give my personal thoughts on the season. Now, like a lot of other people, I was pretty high on Heroes vs Villains, which came out last year. I feel like Australian Survivor took a big step forward last year. And as for this season, I'm happy to say that they did it again, where we had another very solid season of the show. I feel like it was a very consistent ride for the most part, and I feel like this cast was pretty strong, all things considered, to where I would say this is debatably the best Australian Survivor season we've had up to this point, which I think really says something here. Now, as usual with my reviews, I'll be breaking them into four sections, those being the cast, the production decisions, the editing, and the gameplay. But let's not waste any more time. Let's get right into the video. So first up, we have the cast, and as I said a moment ago, I feel like this was a pretty strong cast. I think there was a decent amount of solid players and fun characters along the way. And I guess I'll give my general thoughts on these people in their boot order. So first up, we have Frankie, the first boot, and obviously, she was my winner pick coming to the season. I was very wrong with that. This is probably the worst that my winner pick has done on a season that I covered on the channel. And as for her as a character, I could have done without her. I feel like she didn't really bring much to the table here, and she was a lot more conceited than what I was expecting coming into it. I feel like she was leaning more into the superficial side of her occupation as a salon owner, and in general, like her flirting with Nathan made it clear that she wasn't primed to do super well here. Next up, we have Jessica, who largely went how I expected her to, where she was a mostly bad player, and it was kind of funny seeing her run here with her being the initial target, only for her to later think that she was the one to save herself when in reality she didn't. And it's sort of funny how Eden was allowing her to have this perception up until she tries to target him, so that was a bit of a funny storyline there, causing her to be taken out. Next, we have Peta, and kind of similar to Frankie, I feel like she was largely a disappointment here, where I feel like she didn't really bring too much to the table, though it was interesting seeing her run there. Same thing with Tobias, I feel like he brought nothing to the show, and was just kind of a non-entity taken out relatively early. Next, we have Nathan, and kind of similar to Frankie, I was kind of disappointed with the way he was presented on the show. I feel like he definitely had some upside, but in general got a mostly negative edit. And even with his relationship with Frankie that was defined early on, it was definitely more so him thinking that she was hot than anything else. And in general, I feel like he wasn't primed to do super well here. Next up, we have Viola, who is definitely a fun character here, who has a very interesting backstory. And it seemed like coming into it that she was going to do very well, as it felt like she was set up to have a lot of longevity here, only to be taken out in a surprise move after the swap, which was kind of disappointing, as I felt like she could have brought more to the table here. Next up, we have Sarah, who doesn't really bring too much to the table. I found her to be one of the less interesting characters here, but as a player, I feel like she definitely had some potential there, but she was just largely on the bottom for her entire run, so nothing too much to say there. Next up, we have Garrick, and Garrick was a fun surprise here. We're coming into it, I expected him to kind of be aloof and just be this old guy that was either taken out super early or was just dragged to the end as a goat. But I feel like he was a surprisingly good player and a pretty fun character as well. Like, where you have some pretty funny confessionals, like calling out Kirby during his boot episode. That was pretty funny. There was also him trying to explain how him being a loss prevention officer makes him a rebel, when it seems like that occupation would make him anything but. In general, I did like Garrick, and it was a shame to see him go out so early. Next up, we have Charles, who was one of the more under-edited characters on the show, largely because of him getting screwed over by this twist. And it's kind of a shame, as I feel like there was definitely potential with Charles there, both as a player, but also as a character, where it seemed like he was going to be a big character based off him getting stuff in the intro, only for that to really pan out to nothing. But again, he was fine enough on the show, but obviously got screwed over. Next up, we have Kelly, and Kelly was a fantastic character. I mean, she brought so much entertainment to the show during the pre-merge, like her annoying people, her like meditating and humming super loudly. You have her like being in on plans and trying to pretend to lie and play the game, only for her to lay it on thick. And in general, just her bombastic personality was pretty funny. You also have her moment after she gets voted out where she makes this big reveal that she was a psychologist, and the fact that she treats this as this big deal is also really funny. So again, I really love Kelly on the season. Terrible player, obviously, but I'm glad we got her for as long as we did. Next up, we have Scott, who was pretty under-edited on the show considering he does end up quitting the game, and obviously feel bad for Scott considering the mental health toll that he had on the island that led to him leaving the game. But again, he was pretty likable for the most part, and he was a pretty competent player as well, where I feel like he was playing the middle pretty well for the most part there, and it's just a shame that we didn't get to see more of him on the show. Next up, we have Winna, and Winna's largely fine as a character and as a player as well, where I feel like he doesn't bring too much to the table outside of his background of him being an influencer and him being a competitive eater. And while he has some moments here and there, I feel like a lot of his content was circumstantial, where it felt like he was only being shown when it was absolutely necessary. But again, he was fine enough on the show. Next up, we have Eden, and I love Eden. I feel like he was a pretty likable character and someone who definitely brought some entertainment to the show, especially with his intro package talking about how he's really in the movies and pop culture and how he uses that to relate to people. So I did find Eden to be a pretty rootable figure here. And as I said in my player ranking, I think he was also a pretty strong player for the most part. And it was largely a shame to see him go out as early as he did, but at least it was in a pretty fun blindside where it almost went to rocks. But again, I do like Eden a lot, and he was definitely a bright spot for the season for me. Next up, we have Eileen, and Eileen's also a pretty fun character where she has a pretty notable intro package of her talking about how like she didn't tell her parents that she was applying to the show, and she seems to be a pretty interesting person in that regard. And I think as a character as well, she definitely brought some stuff to the show, like her trying to play the middle. You have her entire arc in episode 4 of her trying to corral the vote and her trying to mother Kelly, only for that to backfire, which I found pretty funny. And I feel like Eileen's a mostly likable character who definitely had her moments on the show. Next up, we have Jaden, and I feel like compared to other people, Jaden's probably not as big of a character considering he was pretty under-edited, but from what we do see of him, he does seem pretty entertaining. Like, I find it funny how a lot of his content early on was just him bench pressing and him like setting up this gym around camp. I did find that kind of funny. You have his whole arc in the Eden Boot episode where Eden's training him up to be a bigger player, only for him to flip for no reason to take Eden out, which I found pretty funny. So I feel like when Jaden was on the show, he definitely brought some interesting moments there, even though he was relatively aloof within the game. Next up, we have Valeria, and Valeria is kind of a mixed bag for me, where she was definitely a bigger character on the show for a lot of it. It's just a question of how likable she truly was. And admittedly, there were definitely some pretty mean-spirited moments, especially during that tribal where she calls Caroline a weak player, and that carries over to the next episode. So I feel like as a player, she's definitely kind of mixed socially and even strategically at points. But again, she was obviously one of the more prominent characters there, and she was a front runner to win edgically for a lot of the season until she was taken out. So again, she did bring some moments, but probably not my favorite character. Next up, we have Alex, and Alex was interesting to watch. I feel like in a lot of ways, he was a Simon Light from last season, where he was this big underdog for a lot of the season, constantly on the bottom, and he was obviously getting a lot of content because of that. Now, I will say that he doesn't have his big moments compared to Simon, which was a bit underwhelming, but still, it was fun seeing his downfall episode with him thinking that he was getting all these people together when in reality he was the pretty consensus target, and obviously him like blowing up Kirby's spot at the tribal that he goes home in. So again, he's probably not as entertaining as Simon, but still he was likable enough. Next up, we have Rihanna, and Rihanna's probably one of the bigger duds on the cast. I feel like she didn't really bring too much to the show in my eyes. And yes, while she has some moments like her winning a couple of immunities and her working with Kirby for a lot of it, I feel like she doesn't really bring too much to the table, and she's kind of a mediocre player as well, so not as big of a highlight for me. Next up, we have Kitty, and kind of similar to Rihanna, I feel like she doesn't really bring too much to the show either, considering she was probably the most under-edited character on the season, considering how far in the game she makes it. But again, she's kind of just whatever, doesn't really bring too much to the table for me. Next up, we have Kirby, who was definitely one of the big characters across the season, definitely one of the biggest players of this season, who got a ton of content on the show. And I do like Kirby. I think she's definitely a likable person. I think she definitely brought a lot to the show game-wise. And it was kind of funny, too, seeing a lot of her decisions. Like, she would make these really chaotic decisions that didn't make a ton of sense, like her throwing hinky votes at the PETA tribal. You have her using Kelly as a number, only for Kelly to later turn on her. You also have her whole rivalry with Ferris, which is pretty interesting, as I feel like in a lot of ways she would call out Ferris for being this big backstabber, when in reality she was the one who would backstab a lot of her allies, whereas Ferris was actually pretty loyal to his people like Raymond and Eileen. So I did find her kind of hypocritical there, but also it was a pretty fun story as well. You have her later deciding to want to take Ferris at the end because she wants to beat the best. And it's sort of interesting seeing how she has a lot of inherent talent for the game. She seems to be very good socially. I just feel like strategically she wasn't all there, but still it was fun seeing her on the season and seeing her rivalry with Ferris. Next up, you have Raymond, who was such a weird character on this season, where on one hand he was relatively under-edited, despite him seeming like he could have been this bigger character on the show. And when we do see him, he has these pretty biting confessionals, like, while some of them can be pretty interesting, you also have him like saying that Eileen would have no future after the show, which felt like it was coming out of left field. You have his whole ploy of pulling votes onto him at the final 9, despite despite the fact that Scott had quit the game not too long ago for mental health reasons, which felt kind of weird as well. In a lot of ways, I feel like Raymond's someone who definitely could have been a bigger character on the show, but I'm not entirely sure whether we're supposed to like him or not. Next up, we have Mark, who was the person who I was high on after Valeria got voted out. And Mark was obviously a pretty big character on this season. Now, I will say that he wasn't the most consistent presence, where there were definitely points later on in the game where he would kind of fade into the background. But for the most part, I found him to be a pretty likable character, definitely one of the bigger players across the season, even if he wasn't the most effective in the world. Next up, we have Caroline, the runner-up of the season. And obviously, she was a pretty big character across the season, even though I was never convinced she was going to win by the end of it, considering that she was pretty quiet early on, getting this massive edit during week 2. She would also kind of disappear during parts of the post-merge and got more negative content there, where she came off as a pretty emotional player, but still she was obviously a pretty massive character across the season, and I'm surprised that she got as far as she did, as I felt like for a lot of the season she was going to be primed to be taken out around the early merge, but then when she wasn't being taken out, it kind of makes sense for her to be a runner-up, though obviously the show does a decent enough job at explaining why she loses. And finally, we have Ferris, the winner of the season, and Ferris was obviously a major character on the season, definitely an attempt to recreate George from the last couple seasons. And obviously, I think he largely delivers. I think he was pretty fun to watch for the most part. Like, I really love like his whole part during the Valeria boot episode where he talks about how he should win Best Supporting Actor. He obviously have his whole rivalry with Kirby that defined a lot of the season, and in general, he was obviously a very likable person, definitely someone who wanted to represent his heritage. In a lot of ways, he feels like a more heroic version of George, where obviously George was definitely prone to backstabbing people at certain points, and while the show tried to present him as being a backstabber, he was actually very loyal to his people for a lot of it, and obviously the fact that he does end up winning by the end of it is also pretty surprising, as I wasn't expecting it to happen. I felt like he was being primed to be taken out towards the end, kind of like what we saw with George last season. So for him to win here is pretty satisfying, and on the whole, I'm pretty happy that he won. So on the whole, I did find this cast here to be pretty enjoyable for the most part. Obviously, there are a couple of duds across the season, but considering how the show is edited, considering the fact that it is Australian Survivor, you kind of expect that to a degree, but I feel like for the most part, there are definitely more likable people and more entertaining people than there are boring people. Next up, we have production, and I think sort of similar to Heroes vs. Villains, this season definitely felt like an improvement over last season, where we didn't have as many game-breaking twists compared to before. I feel like the non-elims were not as intrusive as they usually are, and I think the decision at the end to make this a Final 2 is also a pretty favorable one, as normally I'm not a big fan of Final 3s, so obviously them sticking with the Final 2 is obviously pretty good. Now, I guess again, to more detail about specific twists, there were a couple ones that they threw in here, where first up you have the two non-elims, where both of them involved people being sent over to the other camp, and I feel like this is a mostly acceptable way of handling the non-elims, considering you have to have them, and the fact that there are only two non-elims and none of them happen in the post-merge is obviously pretty ideal, considering that the post-merge is usually where the game picks up, and I'm pretty glad they didn't halt the flow of the game due to having a non-elim. Next up, you have the episode 10 twist, which was obviously an attempt to recreate the tribal that happened in episode 7 of Heroes vs. Villains, where Fraser got taken out, which is obviously an all-time great episode because it was facilitated by a twist. However, I will say that the way that they handle it is probably worse than how they did it last season, where obviously last season they had the challenge to determine who would win individual immunity, but beyond that, it was a pretty standard vote. However, this time they decided to make it so that the winners of the challenge had the sole vote to evict. And to me, this kind of made things a bit broken, where obviously it set things up to where Eileen and Ferris, who were on the outside at that point, could control the vote, despite them not really having the numbers to do so. And I feel like it massively screws over Charles way more than Fraser was screwed over in last season. So while I personally could have done without this twist on this season, I don't think it really harms the season too much, especially when you lose Charles, who was kind of a non-factor on the season anyway. Next up, you have this new twist that they put in right before the merge, where instead of having a reward challenge, they gave players the option to either have a feast or to go back to camp with an idol clue. And for the most part, this was pretty inoffensive, considering that it was only one round before the merge anyway, and it doesn't really factor into the actual vote, considering Kelly was a consensus target regardless. But I do think it was still kind of interesting to have the people on the bottom, people like Rihanna and Mark, really fighting to get this idol, and you also have Ferris on the other tribe finding the idol first, only for him to plant it back so that Alex could find it, just to paint a bigger target on Alex's back. And this was mostly an inoffensive twist, but definitely something that could come back in future seasons. And finally, you have another new twist that they threw in at the auction, that being the ultimate vote twist that Raymond got, that basically made it so that if everyone else voted for him, that he would have the sole vote to evict. And personally, coming into it, I didn't know if it would come into play, considering the amount that Raymond would have to do to make him the consensus target. And obviously, he's able to do so by pretending that he's going to quit, which definitely is not ideal considering we just had Scott quitting the game earlier for similar reasons. So Raymond weaponizing that may not be the best look, but it was still kind of interesting seeing it play out on the season. And while this particular power can come off as a bit overpowered, I do think it's a largely circumstantial power to begin with. And plus, considering that it only takes one person to screw it up by throwing their vote elsewhere, I'm not entirely against this twist, though we'll have to see if it comes back in future seasons. So for the most part, I don't have too many issues with how production handled this season. Now, supposedly production themselves didn't really like this season due to the harsh conditions, and reportedly people were quitting the show while they were filming, which obviously made it seem coming into it that this season wasn't going to be very good. But at the end of the day, I feel like they didn't make too many egregious decisions with how they handled the season. So again, I feel like this is definitely one of the better seasons from a production end for Australian Survivor. Next up, you have the editing, and obviously the editing here is another improvement over previous seasons. Now, at the end of the day, it is still Australian Survivor, so you're going to have a lot of repetitive content of people saying the same stuff over and over and over and over again, and you're going to have the same couple of people getting the bulk of confessionals there. However, at the same time, I think the show does a better job at spreading things out across the cast, where even though there were definitely some big characters, people like Ferris and Kirby, I still feel like other people got big edits as well. People like Mark, for instance. Caroline had some moments to shine. You even have Alex getting a decent amount of content. You also have Valeria getting a decent amount of content. Eden got a pretty big edit. So again, I feel like there are definitely still people getting pretty strong edits across the season, but at the same time, you still have plenty of no names on the cast. People like Charles, people like Scott, people like Kitty, for instance, that got very minimal edits on the show. And you also have a decent amount of people that got no confessionals in their boot episodes, which was obviously not ideal as well. Even beyond that, you have certain episodes that obviously aren't as good as others. I think the Jade and Boot episode in particular was pretty poorly edited, where I feel like the show doesn't do a very good job at explaining why Jaden is a target there. So again, there are definitely some holes within the edit, but for the most part, I feel like this season was an improvement over how other seasons of Australian Survivor are edited. And moving over to the edgic as well, I think this season was also an improvement in that regard, where obviously a complaint that I've had with Australian Survivor in seasons before Heroes vs. Villains was that the show had very obvious winner edits, where you have Blood vs. Water that had a very obvious winner edit. You have Brain vs. Brawn that had a pretty obvious winner edit for the most part. Champion vs. Contenders 2 also had a pretty obvious winner edit. So again, there is this issue of having this really propped up winners edit, but I feel like Heroes vs. Villains was a step in the right direction, where the winner of that season was not as obvious. And I think a lot of what happened in Heroes vs. Villains carried over into this season, where even though Ferris got this pretty massive edit for a lot of it, it was in such a way that made me doubt that he would actually win by the end of it, as we literally saw George on Heroes vs. Villains also have a pretty big edit for the most part. But obviously, I had plenty of doubts that George would win by the end of it, while Liz got this more unconventional winner's edit that obviously made her a pretty big prospect. And I think coming into the season with that context, it really made me gravitate towards other people on the cast, people like Valeria and Mark as potential winner picks for a lot of the season, where despite me having the bigger characters like Kirby and Ferris relatively high for a lot of the season, I was always expecting them to be picked off down the road to where these more under the radar people would rise up. But then Valeria went out, and that caused me to go all in on Mark. And by the end, Mark was eventually taken out. And again, I said coming into my last power ranking that I was expecting Mark to win by the end of it. I thought Ferris was going to be cut at 4 or 3, and that would cause Mark to win the game. But no, it didn't. Instead, Ferris was kind of hiding in plain sight. So I think that definitely makes Ferris stand out to a degree. And I think in terms of his winner edit, again, I feel like Ferris is a pretty big character for the most part. Got a lot of strategic content, got a lot of personal content, got a lot of main character energy during a lot of the season. That obviously made it clear that he was going to have longevity. But even towards the tail end, I was worried that he was going to be a George, someone that would be taken out down the road, until he wasn't, until he actually managed to win that final immunity, cut Mark, and then winning at the end against Caroline. So again, I did personally enjoy the Ferris winner edit a lot, even if it wasn't something I was expecting. So obviously the editing of the season was pretty strong for the most part, at least compared to other seasons of Australian Survivor. And while Survivor US probably takes the cake in terms of having a more balanced edit, I do think Australian Survivor is improving. And finally, let's talk a little bit about the gameplay on this season. And again, I feel like this was a pretty dynamic season for the most part, where even though there were definitely points where tribal lines mattered, they didn't really matter for too long within the game. And there was definitely plenty of interesting votes across the season, and some pretty surprising outcomes as well, like the fact that the Titans ended up voting out two of their bigger physical players early on, people in Frankie and Nathan early on, is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it. When you go over to the Rebels tribe, the fact that Kelly, despite her being this big social pariah, is picked up as a number early on by Kirby is also pretty interesting. You have someone like Kirby who dominates the game but does it in a pretty sloppy way and makes a bunch of mistakes during the season, but despite that is able to recover socially is also a pretty fun aspect to the season. You have other big characters, people like Ferris and Eden, who are able to play pretty strong games. So I feel like the cast definitely brings a lot to the table gameplay wise. And I think there are also some pretty fun rounds over the course of the season where you have the Tobias Tribal, which is definitely interesting due to Kelly flipping her vote at the last moment. You have the Charles Tribal, despite it being brought on by Twist, is definitely a highlight there as well. You have the Eden blindside, which is definitely one of the bigger moments across the season for me. You also have the Valeria vote, where, yes, you can question the morality of Raymond's play there, but still, it was a fun moment there, seeing Valeria being taken out with just one vote. You have the Raymond Tribal, where despite Ferris being this pretty big threat during a lot of the season, and him not winning immunity at the final four, Mark and Caroline decide to take him to 3, thinking that Raymond would lose in fire against Caroline, and thinking that Mark would have this better chance again to the end if Ferris is there at 3 as an easy target there. And you also have Ferris having this final 2 deal with Kirby, only for Ferris to backstab her by the end of it at the final 5, reminding me a lot of the Cody blindside from Survivor 43. So I do think this season definitely delivers on some fun gameplay moments, definitely some pretty fun blindsides, and in general, a pretty consistent ride throughout. And then we get to Ferris, who, again, as a winner, is pretty solid for the most part. I feel like of the network 10 seasons of the show, I would probably have him around number 3 on the winner ranking, where I feel like he played a pretty solid game for the most part, being able to move around a good amount. Now, he definitely faced some adversity where I feel like during the post-swap, that was a pretty wonky section of his game. I feel like Kirby was outplaying him and pulling the Titans, and obviously he needed the twist at the Charles round to get the numbers there. You have him being able to get one up on Kirby at the merge, where he's able to pull in Caroline and Kitty to take out Winna, and obviously taking out Eden not long afterwards, only for him to be blindsided by Kirby again at the following round, losing Eileen along the way. So it's not as if he had sole control of the game. I do think there were plenty of points where Kirby was outplaying him, but it got to the point where Kirby wanted to take him to the end, despite their rivalry for a lot of the season, which you do have to give him a lot of credit for. That, and also Kirby was a much bigger threat in the game compared to him, and he was using her as a shield by that point, and he's obviously able to get her down to final 5 before taking her out there. And he's obviously able to survive the final 4 round despite not winning immunity, which I do find somewhat impressive, mainly due to Raymond remaining loyal to him. But obviously he does need to win that final immunity, which is a knock to his game, but he is able to do it. And at the end of the day, I feel like Ferris is definitely one of the stronger games in Australian Survivor, where even though I would still have David and Mark above him on a winner ranking, I still feel like he is definitely one of the more impressive winners, and really outside of the Final Four, he probably is the most satisfying winner that could have come from that Final Four. So for the most part, I feel like this was definitely a solid season from a gameplay perspective. I feel like there was very rarely a dull round in the game, and there were definitely some pretty fun players here. So on the whole, I do find this to be a pretty solid season of the show. It was definitely an improvement over Heroes vs. Villains. I do feel like at this, and while I usually disagree with the sentiment online that Australian Survivor has been better than Survivor US, I feel like with the way the season has gone and with the way that the franchise is going, I can say that Australian Survivor is definitely better than what Survivor US is at the moment. I feel like the show is definitely heading in the right direction, and I am very much looking forward to next season. But there we go, that'll do it for this week's video, along with my coverage of Australian Survivor. If you like this content, be sure to like and subscribe, really helps with the channel. But I am covering a whole bunch of shows at this point, including Survivor 46, The Amazing Race 36, and Big Brother Canada 12, so you can expect weekly power rankings of those shows. I'm on Patreon, so if you want to consider supporting the channel, you can do so by clicking the link in the description, and you can also join the Discord server by also clicking the link in the description. There's a lot of stuff coming your way, but for now, that is the video. See ya.